that pairs with my weekly article that comes out on Wednesdays. Hope you check out the article, and obviously you're listening to the video right now. So let's get started and talk about some free agents that we're going to be talking about for the next couple of months. First off, we have some breaking news. I think a lot of you saw it happened on Tuesday. Jason Sanders signed a 5-year, $22 million contract. He's a kicker, so obviously not the biggest of news, but he's still rosterable. He was the number one kicker last year, so for what it's worth, he's going to be making a lot more than he was in the previous year. I think he made a little under $700,000. So this coming year, he'll be making $4.4 million per year. Obviously, a big step up if you want to continue to own and roster him. The other news was that J.J. Watt was released from the Texans. Obviously not big news. We're an offensive platform, so it doesn't really affect us, but still worth mentioning. It's obviously a big free agent let go, so we'll see who signs him in this offseason. But as far as today, what we're going to be talking about the Carolina Panthers. We have a couple free agents, and I want to talk about them. They finished 5-11, disappointing season, to say the least. And I write in my article about how one player doesn't make a team, especially in the NFL. It's a team-driven league. But the loss of Christian McCaffrey for every game except for 3, it would just seem like an insurmountable task for them to come back and, provide any positives throughout the season. It's tough on owners when they lose a stud player for the season. Like Saquon, he was lost earlier on after game 2. I would argue it's worse to be drug along all year by a stud player, only for them not to return. Or if they do return to, give you subpar numbers. And you can look at McCaffrey, Michael Thomas, even Joe Mixon for that. All those kind of strung you along all season just to not come back and really do much anything if they did come back. So regardless, CMC looks to put his disastrous 2020 season behind him. And then I'm going to talk about him a little bit later on in the video. But first, let's talk about some contract speculation. So first up, we have 2 free agents that are rosterable in Dynasty Owner Leagues from the Panthers. One is Mike Davis. Number 2 is Curtis Samuel. So first we're talking about Mike Davis. I was lucky enough to own him in both my Dynasty Owner Leagues. I had to pay quite a bit to get him. That big free agent week whenever McCaffrey went down, Davis was the big pickup. So Davis is 27 years old. He's completed 6 years of service in the NFL. He's a journeyman. No real surprise there. He's played for 4 teams in 6 years, so he's moved around quite a bit. He signed a 2-year, $6 million contract with the Bears in 2019, and they actually cut him in the same year, so they cut him later on that season. That contract was picked up by the Panthers, and it'll be expiring. It's actually expiring right now, so he'll be a free agent coming into the 2021 season. And he's kind of a tough player to talk about. I mean, he's probably going to have the same role that he had his entire career, really, and it's a backup man, maybe a goal line back. He finished RB12 in 2020. Obviously, that's because McCaffrey was out every game but 3, as I mentioned before. But even then, he had a very inconsistent season, as more than half of his games ended in less than 11 fantasy points. So that's just – he had some big blow-up games, 3 or 4 off the top of my head. But other than that, you're really getting subpar fantasy value from what he gave you. The pickup was nice to have him, and then obviously his salary at $3 million was very cheap. But he really wasn't startable for more than half the games that he played in. So let's go over some of the highlights of Davis's season. So first of all, he had massive opportunity. Once McCaffrey went down, he was the guy. He ranked 13th in touches for the 2020 season. That's the entire season, not just every game that McCaffrey missed. So he had 224 touches. That's 13th. He was a target hog. He received the 5th most running back targets in 2020 with 70. He had a high touchdown total. He went for 6 rushing touchdowns, 2 receiving touchdowns. He was also a very reliable goal-to-go player, as 5 of his 6 rushing touchdowns came inside the 5-yard line. That's very valuable, and there's probably going to be a few teams out there that are looking for somebody like that. He also has sure hands. He not only ranks 6th in the entire NFL in catch percentage, he was right at 84.3%, but he also had only a single fumble all season, so very reliable hands, just a reliable player in general. I also look at some of his low lights. First was his inefficiency. He was very inefficient. He constantly underwhelmed. One that most of you know is my favorite is the efficiency category, and that's one that he underwhelmed in the most. He rushed 165 times all season for 642 yards for a mediocre 3.6 yards per carry. Not I mean, I guess not the worst technically, but that's not what you're looking for in a lead running back. No bonuses. Despite the extremely healthy workload he had all season, he was unable to get 100 yards at any time, 100 rushing yards at any time throughout this season. So, I mean, I know that, you get 2 extra bonus points if your running back rushes for 100 yards. It's not the pinnacle of fantasy performance to get those 2 points, but it's still something that you would hope somebody like Davis could get once, maybe twice a year at least. So it was disappointing to see that he never rushed for 100 yards. He also had a lackluster second half. He had inconsistent games throughout the entire season, but they seem to be backloaded at the end of the year. So here are his final 9 games played in 2020 and his fantasy point finish: 8.6, 8.7, 8.7, 8.4, 15.9, 10.9, 26.3, good game there, 8.1, and 8.8. So it's just, I mean, look at all those 8-point games. He had 6 of those in those 9 games, and then 10.9. It's just, those aren't startable. Running back 1, definitely not. Running back 2, possibly, but even then you're going to be disappointed with, less than 9 points from most of those games. So I don't know. Maybe the narrative becomes that he can't handle a full workload for an entire season. I don't know if I believe that to be true, but you better believe that NFL teams that are looking at him are starting to, ask themselves that question, if he's going to be able to take on a full load, because he never has. He's never been the guy for an entire season. This is the closest he's been to doing that. So what does it mean for us as dynasty owners? He'll be rostered by a team, by an NFL team, which means he should be rostered by us. He's going to get a cheaper contract. He'll most likely be a backup, change of pace, goal line back, something along those lines. He's very good inside the 5, as I mentioned. He's good at 4th and 1, 3rd and 1. When he needs 1 yard, he can get it for you. So I'm predicting right around a 2-year, $8 million contract, something like that, something in that range, $4 million per year. So a little bit more than he's making this year. I think he's earned that. He showed that he was able to, do, I don't even want to put a number on it really, 60-70% of McCaffrey, and so that's valuable. So we'll see where he ends up. I'll let everybody know when the time comes to update his contract status. So next up is one of my favorite players to talk about, and that is Curtis Samuel. Let me pull up my article here, and we can go through it a little bit. So we're talking about Curtis Samuel, and let's do a blind comparison chart for you. We have 5 teams here. I know it's kind of broken here, kind of where the page broke, but take a look here and tell me what you think of these 5 players. You're obviously probably going to guess that Curtis is one of them, given that we're talking about him, but just take a look and tell me who you think you would like of all this. It's kind of hard to say. I mean, not knowing any of the numbers as far as salaries go or age or anything like that. You might be inclined just to take the player that scored the most fantasy points, which would be Echo, and I can't blame you. I mean, look at those touchdowns, 9 touchdowns. But it's interesting to note that the player who got the most fantasy points had the least amount of receiving yards. He did have the most receptions, so that goes a long way. But then you look at Alpha, most receiving yards, but least receptions. So good air yards, down in the touchdowns. But he finished, was that second? Yeah, second of all 5 of these in fantasy points. So let's take a look and see what I say here. Yeah, like I said, kind of an impossible question to ask without knowing anything else. Probably end up taking Echo. He got you the most fantasy points. So without giving up too much, I'm going to give you Dynasty Dollar for a fantasy point and see if that changes anybody's mind. And it actually makes Echo look better. He is the cheapest as far as value goes, Dynasty Dollar per fantasy point. And then Delta, let's go back up and look at Delta. He is the big contract, it looks like. So pretty underwhelming numbers for somebody who seems to have a very high contract. 80,000 Dynasty Dollars for fantasy point, not great. But the other 4 are pretty comparable. They look like pretty good values. So like I said, safe to assume most of these aren't cheap contracts. Delta's the only one that wasn't. Everyone except Delta made under $3 million in 2020. So there you go. There's a little bit of number to put on it. So let's take a look and find out who everyone is. And it might be a little shocking to you that we have 2 Carolina Panthers right in the first 2 players. So Bravo was actually Curtis Samuel. And he outperformed more in receptions and touchdowns. And he almost beat him in fantasy points. They were right at the same number, 211. DJ Moore beat him by 0.4, but it's negligible. But it's interesting to see you got Landry, who made, I don't think I put the money on here, but he was right around, 15 million, 16 million per year. So that's obviously not a very good value for what he put up in 2020. And you got Juju, who had a a very good year fantasy-wise. You know, he got the touchdowns. He had the touchdown dependence to become a reliable fantasy asset. So it's just interesting to show, you know, his comparison, Curtis Samuel's comparison to some players that finished around him and see maybe what he could make or what his market value might be for next year. And then, you know, I just point out that the biggest shock, you know, any surprises from this thing, my biggest shock was, I guess the main point is that Samuel is comparable, if not more productive, than the 4 coworkers that he has on this list. And that's really what I was trying to get at. And then going to talk about his calculated market value according to SpotTrack was $12.4 million. That's obviously not surprising. Maybe it might seem a little bit high, I guess, but you know, with inflation and the way that the market's going, that sounds pretty comparable. He's going to make over $10 million. There's no doubt in my mind about that. He was arguably the most consistent Panthers wide receiver in 2020. Not the most talented, for sure. You know, I think Moore is still the most talented one in that group, but he might have been the most consistent. So let's go ahead. We're done with our speculation. Let's jump into our contract breakdown. So I'm going to break down just one player today, and we've already talked about him. It's CMC, Christian McCaffrey. So what do we want to say about him? Well, he had a 2020 to forget, obviously, a lost season, 3 games. But in those 3 games, he put up 30.1 fantasy points per game, which is absolutely remarkable. Unprecedented, maybe you could say. There's no way that production is sustainable, and he would have surely dipped below that average if he didn't play an entire season. Or would he have? So I went back, and I wanted to look for myself at his 2019 season. We all know he had obviously another unprecedented season in 2019. So I took a look back, and I compared his stats to then. And wouldn't you know it, he averaged exactly 30.1375 fantasy points per game in 2019. So that's literally exactly right on what he averaged in the 3 games he played in 2020. So then I started to think, well, what would his actual stats have been like for 2020 had he had the same production and played the entire year? And let me pull that up. I'll show you what that looks like. And here it is. 2019 season, obviously he played the entire season, he played all 16 games, compared with his 2020 season 3-game pace if it was drawn out for 16 games. And we see the fantasy points are identical. So right there at the end, fantasy points. But if you start to dive a little bit deeper, rushing attempts would have been up. Rushing yards would have been down. So less efficient rushing. Let's take a look at receptions. Receptions are down a little bit, but receiving yards are quite a bit down. So less efficient receiving too. Touchdowns are really what saved him in the only 3 games he played this season. He would have averaged 32 touchdowns per game for the 2020 season had he kept his pace, and that is not sustainable. I mean, I suppose it's possible, but very, very unlikely that he could have sustained that type of production. What does that tell us? And you can read it here. I mentioned it. We can see that he was obviously less efficient in every way for 2020 except for the touchdown percentage. Small sample size, but there's still numbers that still counts. It's still data that we need to check out. But he was provably less efficient in 2020. So what does that tell us? I would argue that unless his efficiency, rushing, receiving, would have made some major improvements, he was actually on an unsustainable pace. So let's take a look at some of his fellow players, comparable contracts before we wrap up. So this is the 2021 salary. Some of these, they've gone into effect contract-wise, real life-wise, but Dynasty owner, they haven't been updated because they went into effect after league year started last year. So this will be in the 2021 season. The most expensive players minus David Johnson. I didn't include David Johnson because he finished outside RB20 last year, so I didn't include him. So if we take a look, it's awfully interesting that McCaffrey, most expensive. We know that. Everybody pretty much knows that. Fantasy points, you can see that. It's off the charts compared to all those other players. But if you look at his Dynasty dollar per fantasy point, he's actually the most valuable. He has the most value of any of these other players as well. And Derrick Henry is the only one that's closest because he has a cheaper salary. So if we compare his 2020 would have been season, even really his 2019 season pace, he's still the biggest value of all 5 of these players, even though, well, 2 of them are making, what is that, $3.5 million less? 2 of them are making $1 million less. So it's very surprising. I say it later on that it's very surprising to find any group of players. You take 5 players at any position, it doesn't matter where they're at, any player at any position, top 5, it's very rare to find the top player, the top salary player, to be the most valuable, to be the biggest value. And I go and talk about that later on, but it's very rare to see that. And I think Travis Kelce probably would apply this year, maybe because Kittle was hurt only. But without that, I mean, I don't know. He's by far the running back I would rather have of all 4 of these still. And then I go and talk about a little bit more. Here's a little trivia question for you all. So let me ask you a question. On top of your head, who do you think is the youngest? Of these 5, who do you think is the youngest? Give me a second. It surprised me. I mean, some of you might know their age a little better, but it's actually McCaffrey. McCaffrey is the youngest, and it's really not even close. So Kamara, Cook, and Elliott were all born in the summer of 95. Henry was born in the winter of 94, so he's the oldest. CMC was born in the spring of 96, so he's 9 months younger than the 3 other youngest on this list. So like I said, might not be surprising to you, surprising for me. CMC is still my choice. I mean, not just because of the age, but just because of the level of production he's put up. He's still my choice of all these elite running backs. Once we get started talking about Saquon, Taylor, Miles Sanders, then we might have a conversation because their contracts are so much cheaper. But, as of right now, I think he is the number 1 back to own of those 5 top producing guys, at least top salary guys for the 2021 season. And obviously we have a few running backs that have yet to, be shown what their contract could be, so that might need to be adjusted. Either way, it's I feel like this one was a good read. I had a lot of fun writing this article. I like talking about Curtis Samuel. I mentioned earlier a couple months ago that he's probably the number 1 player I'm interested to see where he goes and how much he's going to make. Just because there could be a wide variation of how he does and really his entire career outlook based on where he lands. So anyway, I want to thank everybody for listening. Go check out the article. Like I said, it's a good read. I had fun writing this one. And just follow us on Dynasty on our Twitter. Follow me. You got my credentials down here at the bottom. I appreciate everybody following me and liking the video. I hope you all take care and be safe.